Hey friends, welcome back and thanks for pushing play. We certainly do appreciate it. Hey, just a little housekeeping before we get started with our guest, David Quintieri, the author of The Money GPS, who's on the line. I want to thank everybody for their contributions to our post, What Can We Do Better? We got more than 200 comments. Very proactive, helpful comments and suggestions, and we've implemented already many of them. For instance, when you click on an article at SGT Report, a new window opens up, so you're not taken away from SGT Report. In addition to that, we're posting new articles with many of the great sources you guys have recommended. I've started posting MP3s of my interviews because we did get our server issue figured out, so you can download those MP3s if that's more convenient, and lots of other things in the works. I've got a website I've been working on for over a year now called thephaser.com, and the goal of that website was going to be to allow readers to post their own articles or headlines, but that's proved more difficult than I thought it would be. So I launched the website basically because some of the feedback we got said SGT Report could use a refresher or a different, more professional appearance. And I think the Phaser will hit that mark well. I think it'll be a great source to share with friends and family who are skeptical. It has a more polished look, and you will find news and information that's different than some of the things you're seeing at SGT Report. So with that said, I do want to introduce my guest. It's David Quintieri. He's the author of The Money GPS. TheMoneyGPS.com is his website, and he's The Money GPS on YouTube. And boy, is his YouTube channel taken off. David, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you back, man. I think the last time we spoke was about 8 months ago, and so much has been happening since then, it's hard to know where to begin. One of the things I do want to say, though, David, is sometimes we get comments from folks. One in particular, this one goes out to Bob. He likes to say, I'm getting really sick and tired of the doom and gloom and the fear porn, and you guys would really do better to, stop being so gloomy all the time. David, I'd really like your take on that, because as I look at the news, I'm seeing from Max Slavo at SHTFplan.com, Alan Greenspan himself warning there will be a significant market event. Something big is going to happen. And David, I don't think that's a good thing that's coming our way. Let me ask you this, David. Is that fear porn, or is that something we should be reporting on?
Absolutely, we should be reporting on it. It's quite funny because I get the exact same thing on my channel all the time, or when I watch other channels or read different news websites. We always get that same amount of denial, and we heard that same amount of denial right before the Great Depression, the exact same thing. In fact, they said in 1929, only weeks before the actual tip over, we had tons of analysts and those in the finance industry and the mainstream media. They said, we will have a perpetual boom in the stock market. There will never be another, well, they always called them depressions before then. We will never have another depression again. And then what happened? Of course, we had the Great Depression. So this is kind of, this thing that I just ignore. I sort of, find it to be comedic relief in many ways, but it is quite sad because a lot of people get pulled away and they think that it's, this is all conspiracy theories and everything. But what I'd like to address is that we have literally hundreds of indicators to show us that everything is heading in a downward direction. We're heading back to the Lehman crisis in terms of these indicators. If you just take away the U.S. stock market and the recent rise in the U.S. dollar, you will have such a different picture of the world. But of course, they always focus on these two indicators out of the hundreds and thousands of different indicators that there are. So of course, you're going to have a biased opinion when that's all you're looking at.
Well, absolutely, and you just used the term conspiracy theorists. Let's explore that just for a second. I always like to point out folks that use that as a pejorative are merely taking a page from the CIA's own playbook, which is to label people who would question authority, who would question anything coming out of the government as conspiracy theorists. That's a pejorative designed by the CIA to quell dissent. You write on your website, the government structure is set up to enable corporations to lobby, bribe our representatives and pass laws that are often criminal. As a result, we have a catastrophe on our hands. Derivatives exceed 1.5 quadrillion in total value, which far surpassed the GDP for the entire world 25 times over. This derivatives bubble is collapsing, and I think it's collapsing at a very fast pace behind the scenes, largely in part to what's going on in Greece. What is your take currently on the derivatives problem, David?
Well, the derivatives are very interesting indeed because we see the financial industry never looking at it as a potential problem. And that, to me, is extremely dangerous when I'm thinking about this, because you have the amount of derivatives on any one of these major banking institutions being more than the GDP of the world, a single bank. So what happens then if that single bank gets itself into a little predicament? How will the government ever be able to bail it out? And that's something else I want to talk about later. However, this is impossible. It is mathematically impossible to ever pay back, and they know that's the case. So they're playing games right now. They're buying time, but ultimately it has to collapse. It must, simply because of the way it's set up. They've expanded it in order to continue on with this boom. We had the housing boom, and then we had, that up into the commodities boom and the stock market, and everything was booming and booming and booming because one bubble fuels another bubble as it pops. It never is allowed to basically go in a downward direction. There's always a new bubble forming. And right now we have the derivatives expanding so far that it is simply a mathematic impossibility for this ever to be okay.
It's impossible to settle all of the accounts when the derivatives collapse. It will be a house of cards that collapses really at free fall speed, much like we saw happen with World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. And David, it's my understanding that the absolute pinnacle of the derivatives problem is Deutsche Bank, with a $62 trillion problem that isn't going away soon. I reported about this just the other day, and I quote, "At this hour, all worldwide bank derivatives, which are trillions of dollars in debt, are tied to Deutsche Bank," end quote. These guys are all in on it together. Again, you want to talk about conspiracy theories? How about banks colluding against humanity to indebt entire nation states to unrepayable debt, as Goldman Sachs has done to Greece, as J.P. Morgan is more than happy to do to this nation as it partners with the Fed in issuing endless trillions of dollars of endless unrepayable debt. The real Ponzi scheme, David, is these international banks and their collusion, their 100-to-1 bets that at this point are going south. The real conspiracy theory is international banks against humanity.
I completely agree with you. Now, historically, we've seen traditional enemies like Hitler, for example, Mao, Stalin, and we see them up on the stage and they're there, and all of our attention, all of our focus is on these individuals. They are the enemy. We must take them down. And for example, World War II begins and we have to take down Hitler. But now, today, there is a much different story because they're able to hide themselves. The real enemies are able to hide themselves in their disguises. They wear suits and ties. They are the technocratic elite. They are the bankers who actually have control over this system. There's no ability for us to actually see them right with our eyes. That's why the public is basically unable to visualize what's happening, because it goes on behind the scenes. Your government goes out there, they make rules, they make decisions, they call it the Patriot Act, they call it freedom, they call it all these names that they use, liberty, but they're really disguised in actuality for their criminality. This is what I've been seeing, this is what I've been witnessing for years and years. Researching this is how we always see this happening in every single country around the world, where they use the governments to actually create laws that benefit the bankers, benefit the elite, benefit the agricultural industries, biotech industries, pharmaceutical industries, and never once does it ever help the individual. And that's what scares me a lot, because I'm researching this and you look at the people, the actual individuals, consistently, year over year, their real wealth is declining. At the same time, we have the approval for Congress, for example, being less than 10%, depending on the poll you look at. So the people have actually lost faith in their government. At the same time, they're more dependent on their government. And this is going to eventually hit that tipping point, and we are going to have a very big problem on our hands.
Yes, and we already have a very big problem on our hands just as it relates to our own $18 trillion in debt, of course, climbing on a daily basis at an astronomical rate, and the $202 trillion of unfunded liabilities, as Kotlikoff has warned about. But, of course, that warning was, I think, 3-4 years ago at this point, so it's probably far north of $202 trillion. Obviously, it is unrepayable. I do want to point out to everybody that, again, and I point this out a lot, David, the United States government has given itself license to use propaganda domestically. It has given itself license to use essentially psyops against the people. So, again, when the government has said that it can do that, lawfully, of course it's illegal, but it's lawful if they say it's lawful, right? Because they make up the rules. When the government can use propaganda against the people, how are we to know that anything they say is true? I say question everything at this point, David, because when the guys that make the rules say they can lie to you lawfully, all bets are off. And I want to point out this great video from my friend Brother John, his latest called Cyber Scare, in which he recounts the claim that officials are making that some $300 million to $1 billion has been stolen from international banks in a cyber war. And he goes through the New York Times article on this piece by piece, tearing it apart, because clearly it's absolute nonsense and it's propaganda. They are preparing us, David, to fleece us and take everything and bring this system down and blame it all on a cyber war. And then when they've done that, they can also lock down the internet. David, I think we are potentially moving toward a digital dark age, as I've reported on recently.
I believe that we will head into a new scenario for the internet. I long ago, even before I began my research, knew that corporations are greedy, and that's about as far as I knew. And I thought that this would eventually have to end because the freedom on the internet is something that the governments, the big businesses don't want. Of course, you can open up your own alternative media, and we are obviously making gains on the mainstream media as it just continues to decline. It is really dying out there. But of course, they need to lock that down because they can see what's happening. Now, there's going to be what they're calling Internet 2.0, and there's all sorts of different names. But I see it going to more of a similar to your cable system that you would have at home with your television, where you only have a few select channels to visit. They can lock down basically all of the alternative news should they choose to, or they can do this in an emergency situation. Regardless, we really don't have many options when that's the case. So we'll have to see what happens in the future. It seems like there is very little resistance on this one.
David, well, why don't we talk about just a few topical issues before we lose you? Would you like to talk about Greece, the Ukraine, or the ports shut down? I'm very concerned about this strike on the West Coast with the ports being shut down because it really is a massive threat to our just-in-time delivery system in this country. And definitely it's a threat to our economy, which is already very, very fragile. What should we talk about, Greece, Ukraine, or the ports shut down?
Let's try and get to it all. If we want to start with Greece, all I will say is that we have, a little bit of an issue to worry about because, of course, every government makes promises. When they want to get in, we saw with Obama, hope and change, hope and change, hope and change. He never tells you what that change is, but, of course, as long as he keeps repeating himself, he'll get the people to believe him. Now, that's what concerns me about Greece, although I do have some, at least in the rhetoric that's coming out of there, at least it's beneficial. They say, look, the Troika is bad, so at least it gets the people focusing on the right idea. So that is something good. Now, what's going to happen from it is a different story because the Troika still has to approve everything that's happening. The Troika is there specifically to put the country down. They're not just going to let go of what's happening there in Greece. Well, what's happened? The GDP, debt to GDP ratio went ballistic basically from the crisis that occurred back in around 2011 up until today. And that's only a few short years. So we can see what they're able to do, what they're capable of, and that is going to extreme rates. So that's what I'll say for Greece. We have to really just see it as it goes along. I don't have good faith in them at all, not because of what their capabilities are, but simply because the Troika has such a stronghold over all of these nations. Now, just to move on quickly over to the Ukraine, what really worries me most is how that connects in with the bigger geopolitical issues. So we have Ukraine calling on Canada, calling on the West, in fact, to send over the weapons, send over the money, give us everything we need to fight the big bad Russia. Now, Russia may or may not be, actually doing what they're saying they're doing in the mainstream media. We know how they really have been messing around with things. We saw the fake images that came out over there trying to show us that, where the action is at, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But what I'm actually concerned about is ISIS. Now, if ISIS gets a stronghold in that region, in the Middle East, and they're able to pull their troops into Syria, we're going to have a big problem there. Because we know that Syria and Russia are partners, that is obviously going to pull Russia in, and they're already there protecting Syria. We have Iran helping as well. So you're going to have a major geopolitical disaster, and of course this could bring in all of the militaries of the world where we have an actual World War III scenario. This isn't rhetoric, this isn't conspiracy, this is actuality. We're talking about such a drastic thing happening, all because the West is funding ISIS, ISIL, Islamic State, the Caliphate, whatever name they're giving this week. It doesn't matter. What's important to know is that ISIS is there. They're finding ways to gather more and more troops. They're going to make their way into Syria. At that point, Russia's going to get upset. If Russia comes in from the other side, we're going to have a big problem because obviously Assad and the West are not seeing eye to eye right now. So this is a major concern for me. Then you add in the Ukraine, which is obviously requesting the transmission of weapons and everything over to it. We're building up consistently on the border of the Ukraine and Russia. We saw what happened with Crimea. Where does it all end? I'm not sure, but it's not good. Either way, this is not actually slowing down. I see it heating up, in fact. So that's really what I'm seeing for the future. The ports, what I will say is that whenever you have an issue with any particular commodity, with any particular government, or perhaps a natural disaster, these all affect the prices of commodities. They affect the economy, not just of that area that is directly affected, but also in a wider spread, in a ripple effect, essentially. So whenever you have ports that may be in the situation that they're in right now, we have to look at not just what's happening right there, but also the geopolitical ripple effect afterwards. And that's all I will note about that.
Well, a couple of things. I do want to note again, the Baltic Dry Index continues to hit an all-time low, which is the biggest canary in the coal mine that I can think of, indicating a total global collapse of economies, maybe the scale of which we've never seen before. But just to circle back to Ukraine, I couldn't agree with you more, David. This government, which toppled the former Ukrainian government and put a puppet in place in Kiev, is actively talking about arming Kiev against Putin, against Russia, and Russia has said that would be considered an act of war. This government and NATO is absolutely boundless in its aggression, David, against Putin, against surrounding Russia, and against pushing the world towards the precipice of World War III. I'm very, very concerned about it because, of course, the Russian bear is not afraid to stand up to aggressors, and the Russian bear has thermonuclear weapons. It is a very big concern, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is really another Cold War that is occurring right now, but if you look closer, it's sort of a proxy war at the same time that's happening because the West has been funding the Ukraine and Russia is fighting on the other side. And we see the same thing, like I mentioned, with ISIS. It's all proxy wars that are being fought right now, and eventually the proxy wars tend to run out as you make your way into actual hot wars that take place. This is very concerning because obviously both sides have nuclear weaponry, and if they were to use them, who knows what would happen. This is pretty bad. We have enough to worry about with the natural disasters that are occurring, with even things like Fukushima that are really being a plague to our entire ecosystem. And then we have things like geopolitical issues that are going on right now that we simply can't keep up with it. Every single day there's something new. How can this ever go on? How can we ever fix what's there when everything is piling up consistently? It's really troublesome.
It is troublesome, and I just want to end with this, David. For listeners, I know it sounds insane to say that what's happening in the Ukraine is pushing the world towards the precipice of nuclear war. But guess what? It wasn't that darn long ago when JFK was still alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis that the Joint Chiefs were pushing JFK to thermonuclear war. They wanted to go to war with Russia, and they recommended a first strike against Russia. Only the sanity of JFK pulled us back from the precipice. Otherwise, you and I, had that happened, David, had JFK not had the sense to pick up the phone and talk directly to Khrushchev, had JFK not had the sense to not listen to the Joint Chiefs, you and I would not be having this conversation because our parents and grandparents probably would not have survived the nuclear exchange that the Joint Chiefs were pushing for. So I'm very dubious of the Pentagon, and I'm very, very dubious of those that have the power and have their fingers on the trigger. It's a very scary world in which we live, especially when the formerly greatest nation on the face of the planet, the formerly freest nation on the face of the planet, seems to be the aggressor in so many of these events that we're seeing around the world. Our guest has been David Quintieri, the author of The Money GPS. David, can you tell people what you're working on and tell people about your website? Tell us anything you want people to know before we lose you.
Absolutely. So what I've been doing recently is generally what I'll do is post a new video every day about the geopolitical events, about sort of the financial system and other things as well that I get into. But what I found is that we're always covering the day-to-day issues, which are great. It's excellent because we need to really unveil the truth, as I like to say. Now, what about those individuals who have never heard about any of this before? They don't understand the financial system. There's no real starting point for these people. So I've begun to create really an educational foundation for people. And this is going to be done in multiple videos that I've been doing, and I've already begun this, and essentially to get people that foundation of knowledge so that they can start there and then learn the more advanced teachings that we're always getting into every day. So basically, it's financial education that they never learned in school. So that's at my main YouTube channel, where you just go to The Money GPS on YouTube. If you go down to the bottom, you could see the e-course that's there, and it's 100% free, of course. You can just get on there and view the videos as I collect on them. We have, I believe it's coming on close to 17,000 subscribers on the YouTube there. It's grown. I remember my first interview on SGT, I probably had about 200 subscribers, so it's definitely changed quite a bit. And my goal is simply to be the foundation of education for people that simply can't get it elsewhere because it's locked down. There really is no truthful education out there at all in this regard. That's for sure. It's not being taught in the schools. The parents don't know the information. The grandparents never told them. But unfortunately, we're at this point right now where if we don't prepare, if we don't actually start learning about this, we're going to be in big trouble. So that's what I've done. I wrote the book a few years ago now, The Money GPS, and that has been, an excellent eye-opener for so many people that have contacted me, and I've been very grateful to have written that. But what I've understood is that a lot of people, they're not able to read a book at the moment. Perhaps they are too busy or what have you. So that's why I've created the YouTube, and that's why I'm doing this educational system, because it allows them to basically get that foundation, and they won't have to necessarily invest a few hours to read the book.
Well, it sounds like a great way for folks to take advantage of your information to help wake up friends and family. I think that's what you're going after, because we all know, David, that it's really hard to wake up those closest to us, friends, family, colleagues. So many people in this country have normalcy bias, and they are not educated on the fundamentals, so they're not equipped to even have these conversations. They don't understand what the Federal Reserve is. They don't understand what money is. They don't understand the foundations of money. They don't understand constitutional money. They don't understand the basics. They're not equipped to have the conversation. So we certainly do appreciate your work, and congratulations on the success of your YouTube channel. Again, our guest has been David Quintieri of The Money GPS, themoneygps.com, and The Money GPS on YouTube. David, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on.
It's my absolute pleasure. And guys, thank you so much for pressing play. Thank you for sharing this information with others if it resonated with you. And thank you for supporting us at sgtreport.com, thephaser.com, and thelibertymill.com, where truth prevails. Have a great week.